Welcome to POTUS 2017, where we keep an eye on the Oval Office and pour cold, hard facts on the overheated political rhetoric. I'm Brian Lehrer. Today, two hot issues that the White House has been addressing: reproductive rights and urban crime. Soon after an estimated 3 million people at women's marches worldwide protested Donald Trump's inauguration, the new president reignited the war over abortion. He signed an executive order ending aid for international women's health projects that even mention abortion as an option. And he nominated a highly conservative man to the Supreme Court, one who could help overturn Roe versus Wade. We'll get to that right away. And later in the broadcast, we'll throw some facts at President Trump's talks and tweets about, quote, the carnage in our cities. Nationally, the murder rate has been cut in half over the past 20 years in large cities. We'll ask a scholar, where's the carnage and why the regional differences that do exist? First, though, abortion and the nomination of 10th Circuit Appeals Court Judge Neil Gorsuch. Of course, Gorsuch will need Senate approval, but he made it clear he approves of the Senate.
I consider the United States Senate the greatest deliberative body in the world, and I respect the important role the Constitution affords it in the confirmation of our judges. I respect, too, the fact that in our legal order, it is for Congress and not the courts to write new laws. It is the role of judges to apply, not alter, the work of the people's representatives. A judge who likes every outcome he reaches is very likely a bad judge, stretching for results he prefers rather than those the law demands.
Is a court that includes more of that kind of thinking, leave laws to the lawmakers, more likely to overturn Roe v. Wade or same-sex marriage? What's the worldwide picture of abortion rights, and how much of a blow to women's health is Trump's global gag rule? Joining us, Françoise Girard, president of the International Women's Health Coalition and an advocate and expert on women's health, human rights, HIV, and AIDS. And via Skype, Kathryn Kolbert. She has defended abortion rights before the Supreme Court and was state counsel for the ACLU's Reproductive Freedom Project here in New York City. Kolbert currently directs Barnard College's Athena Center for Leadership Studies. Welcome, both of you. Thank you very much for joining us. Françoise, how legal is abortion worldwide? People in America don't have a sense of what's happening outside our borders, I don't think.
The legal regime varies from country to country, but in almost all countries, abortion is legal for some indications: to save the life of the woman, to preserve her health, even her mental health, in cases of rape and incest. So there's in almost all countries possibilities for legal abortion.
So the reasons for abortion are largely regulated. We don't have that in this country, really, but it's a big topic of conversation for a potential future regulation.
Yeah, I understand that that's something they're considering, yeah.
How many organizations accept this U.S. funding, which is now going to be restricted in how it can be used?
Hundreds of organizations are contractors to the U.S. government to implement health programs in the developing world, and they in turn have sub-recipients, subcontractors. It is those foreign organizations, the subcontractors, that are affected by the global gag rule, which is this rule that President Trump revived last week, which forbids foreign organizations that receive global health assistance from the U.S. government to even mention abortion, whether in the consultation room between the nurse and the doctor and the patient, or in the democratic debate in their own country.
So before we bring in Kitty on the domestic picture, this gag rule cannot be mentioned. This means abortion cannot be mentioned by doctors, by people in women's health clinics.
Right. You can't even have a pamphlet in the waiting room saying, safe abortion, what are your options? that would violate the global gag rule. And if you as a doctor who receives patients and have an experience of what unsafe abortion, what the damage it is causing in your country, you can't engage in the democratic debate in your country. If, for example, there's a debate about whether the law should be liberalized in your country, you can't bring that experience to bear. So it affects the practice of medicine and also democratic debate in the country.
I didn't realize there was a political gag rule as well.
It's a complete gag. That's why it's called a gag rule.
Practitioners,
yeah,
yes.
It really wants to silence any conversation about abortion in the country. So the idea is that if you take U.S. government money, you are gagged. Now, you can refuse to take U.S. government money, but that is significant funding because the U.S. government is currently the largest funder of reproductive health programs in the developing world and of women's rights programs.
Kitty Kolbert, tell us about Supreme Court Justice nominee Neil Gorsuch in this respect. My understanding is he doesn't have much of a track record, if any, on the question of Roe v. Wade or other abortion rights in this country from the bench, right?
Well, yes and no, Brian. I think what we have seen from his record is that he considers himself to be a protege of Justice Scalia, who was vehemently opposed to abortion and was ready to overturn Roe. He has given us hints in a number of decisions involving contraceptive access and religious liberty that demonstrates his antipathy to contraceptive access and reproductive health care. And I think he is somebody who, unfortunately, will continue to be part of the conservative bloc that opposes Roe versus Wade. The importance right now is where we are on the court. The court in this last term decided 5-3 to strike down regulations on abortion from Texas. And you remember the Texas case where I was here talking with you about it. That gives us, if he is confirmed, he would be the fourth vote to oppose abortion. So while this is a critically important appointment for a whole range of issues, for abortion, it's the second justice that President Trump could appoint that will really be the deciding factor.
Right, because he's replacing Scalia, who was already there on that side, and it's if somebody else leaves, one of the more liberal justices, on this question where the old Roe decision really gets put at risk. How do you think, Kitty, that this will come up at the confirmation hearings? Because I think history tells us and practice tells us that no Supreme Court nominee is going to answer yes or no to the question, would you vote to uphold Roe versus Wade?
That's right. I don't think he will answer that question. But I think he will give us many hints about, A, his judicial philosophy, which is one of looking at the text of the Constitution only. And we've got to remember when the Constitution was adopted, we had white male citizens, women couldn't vote, women's reproductive rights were never really an issue. It's really hard to say that the framers had an understanding of what the Supreme Court ought to do on abortion. And if that's your basic philosophy of life, it's not good for reproductive health. But more importantly, I think what he's shown us on his religious liberty cases, the Hobby Lobby case, cases involving exemptions for religious freedom, he basically is saying that corporations that have religious values should be able to discriminate against people who want reproductive health care and should be able to discriminate against people who are seeking protection of civil liberties. And that is incredibly disturbing in my view.
One more thing before we come back to Françoise. Judge Gorsuch will probably ask how much he respects precedent. And even if his personal opinion is that Roe was wrongly decided in 1973, it's now, quote, settled law, unless I'm overusing that term, for more than 40 years. So how do you think someone like him would take into account the fact that this has been the law or the Constitution as interpreted by the Supreme Court for so long?
Yeah, I'm not hopeful on that view. Remember that even in my case in 1992, the court was ready to overturn Roe despite 30 years of precedent. Justice Rehnquist wrote an opinion doing so. It was never adopted by the court because Justice Kennedy changed his mind.
You argued a case, it was a Pennsylvania case that was known as Casey, and where Roe did actually come before the court again in '92, and there were some restrictions that were enacted, but basically Roe was upheld, right?
That's correct. And the court at that point was ready to overturn Roe. Justice Kennedy was had voted with the majority at the beginning, changed his vote, and that is how we have preserved Roe ever since. But here's the thing is, Judge Gorsuch has said on a couple of occasions that the Chevron decision, which really gives great deference to Congress and administrative bodies to interpret congressional law, which has been precedent for many years, he's ready to throw that out. So I don't think he is one of those people that is fearful of keeping his viewpoint, even if there has been precedent.
Right, even after a long period of precedent on one thing or another. Françoise,
that's correct.
You have argued that the question of abortion and contraception around the world, especially in developing countries, is not just about itself, that it also has implications for women's equality, even for democracy. Make that case.
Well, women face a particular challenge all their life, which is to control their fertility and their bodies because of their biology. And so it is clear and has been clear to us in the women's movement and those of us working with women's organizations all over the world for a long time, that unless you can control how many children you will have and when you will have them, and whether or not you can control your body, whether or not you can be subject to violence and so on, is crucial to your equality as a citizen. Whether or not you can stay in school, whether or not you can have access to the labor market, whether or not you can move about freely in society without fearing repercussions, whether or not you can choose the person you will marry. These are really fundamental questions to citizenship. So we don't see how this question of reproductive rights and control of your body can be isolated from the rest of women's rights, which is often the case that's being made, that somehow that's a separate issue that we can put aside. It is core to the autonomy and the equality of women.
Why does the U.S. spend this money in the first place? I think we're talking about $10 billion, roughly, in women's health aid that goes to poor countries, largely in sub-Saharan Africa and some other poor regions.
A lot of it is for HIV prevention, treatment, and care. The vast bulk of that, it's about $6.8 billion, that is HIV funding through the PEPFAR program, the emergency program on AIDS relief that President Bush, W. Bush, put in place in 2003, 2004. The rest of it is maternal health, newborn health, tuberculosis control, malaria control, reproductive health, family planning, contraception. Why? Because the well-being, the stability, and the health of those countries matters to the United States as a matter of security, but also, just pure humanity. And the U.S. has a long history of engagement in these issues globally, and most recently with the work on HIV and AIDS has done tremendous work. Has saved millions of lives, has turned around the economy of those countries that were losing so many people to HIV, the HIV pandemic. So,
are they allowed to talk about contraception in HIV prevention and still get US
until
aid?
now, the global gag rule did not apply to this fund. It was only applied to the family planning account. $600 million of funding was affected by the global gag rule, and so it was primarily reproductive health family planning organizations that were having to certify that they weren't going to talk about abortion, which is of course perverse, because if you're dealing with contraception at some point, you're dealing with pregnancy and the question of abortion. Now the global gag rule is expanded to cover all global health assistance. So there's a number of accounts that are now concerned, including HIV, which means that, for example, groups that are dealing with pregnant women who are affected by HIV will have to choose whether they take the substantial U.S. funding or provide substandard care. Either way, it's a catch-22, right?
Yes.
It's an untenable situation.
Kitty, I guess what ties the domestic and the international strands here together is the principle that a lot of Americans don't want their tax dollars to go for paying for abortions, even if they think abortion should be nominally legal. And domestically, that comes into play with what's known as the Hyde Amendment, named after former Congressman Henry Hyde, who kept introducing it and reintroducing it because it keeps getting renewed, that says no taxpayer funding may be used for domestic abortions, which means primarily for Medicaid. So federal funding for abortions for poor women is out. Domestically, just as federal funding for abortions for poor women through this international gag order will be out. Is the Hyde Amendment up in any new kind of way under President Trump and the current Republican Congress than it has been in the past?
Yes. In fact, the House, as one of its first efforts within days of them convening, passed a bill which would make the Hyde Amendment permanent. Rather than bringing the issue up every year, it would become permanent law, and extending the ban on federal funding to a range of other programs, including, for example, our servicemen and women or people who are part of the federal health insurance policy. And let me just say, Brian, that the Affordable Care Act was really important because it provided a range of reproductive health services in all health insurance that was obtained through the state programs. And that was a big expansion to the availability of contraceptive access for low-income women and women who are part of health insurance programs. I think we, every time we turn around, somebody in Congress, whether it be the House or the Senate, is trying to repeal those provisions and make it much more difficult for women to have access to abortion and contraception.
Is that to say that the private plans on the Obamacare exchanges had abortion coverage, even though expanded Medicaid did not?
No, they did not have abortion coverage. They weren't required to have abortion coverage.
Right.
Some of them did. You could
Right.
opt into a plan that
Right.
did. But what Obamacare did is it said that all forms of FDA-approved contraception have to be part of every plan that is covered under the Affordable Care Act. So it greatly expanded access to contraception. And for most women, that is their primary way they receive health care. Low-income women go to the gynecologist because they want to get birth control. And that's the first place that they receive, that they meet a doctor and they can get referred to a variety of things. For example, Planned Parenthood, which is one of the very first places people go, is a primary referral source for just basic health care for women.
And that's probably going to get cut by the new Congress, or at least they seem to be setting themselves up to do that, and they say they'll replace all of that funding, but they'll keep all the funding, they'll just give it to other kinds of women's health organizations. We'll see what happens. Françoise, final question for this segment.
Yep.
Is this part of a broader defunding of the United Nations and international organizations that's part of Trump's worldview or his team's worldview? There was a little noticed announcement that they were going to withdraw a lot of funding from the UN, and then they seemed to back off that.
This is the other part of the attack on women's rights and international organizations. The global gag rule affects USAID and other US government funding streams. So that's bilateral assistance, right? But we saw that last week. The administration floated executive orders which would have cut United Nations funding very significantly. And they were discussing something in the order of 40% cuts in funding, which would be massive because the US is the biggest contributor to the United Nations in terms of compulsory and voluntary contributions. And it would have also cut peacekeeping funding and attacked the United Nations Population Fund most directly, which provides reproductive health to women refugees all over the world.
But they're not going through with that for now.
For now, they've pulled it, but we assume it's coming back.
So a debate to come. Thank you very much. And
Thank
Kitty
you, my
Kolbert,
pleasure.
thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian.
And viewers, will continue in a minute with some additional evidence. time for evidence-based politics, where we pour cold, hard facts on the overheated political rhetoric. From campaign launch to inauguration, it's been one of Donald Trump's rallying cries, law and order.
Devastating what's happening to our inner cities. You have the inner cities, and you have so many things, so many problems, so many horrible, horrible problems. The violence, the death. You can't walk out the street, you buy a loaf of bread, and you end up getting shot. Places like Afghanistan are safer than some of our inner cities. And the crime, and the gangs, and the drugs that have stolen too many lives and robbed our country of so much unrealized potential.
Some people who live in big cities like New York and Los Angeles might ask, what is Trump talking about? I don't see any unusual amount of violence in my city, and hasn't violent crime actually been dropping? Well, over 20 years it has dropped, but there has indeed been a reversal recently in certain cities, Chicago among them. A report done for the Justice Department last year details all this. It also analyzes the major theories behind the surge, including the so-called Ferguson effect. The study's author is Richard Rosenfeld, professor of criminology at the University of Missouri. He joins us via Skype from St. Louis. Professor, hello from New York. Thank you for doing this with us.
My pleasure.
And I'm going to put up a few of your data graphics right away. So here's a chart that shows a 20-year span, 1995 to 2015. The red line on top is large cities. The blue line on the bottom is the national rate. So crime came down at a much faster rate over 20 years in big cities than it did everywhere else. Of course, it started lower everywhere else. But what does this graph tell us?
Well, it's telling us that what's been called the Great American Crime Drop is far from over. We did see an increase in homicide in many of the big cities in 2015 and again last year, 2016. But even including those increases, we're still way, way down from where we were in the early 1990s.
And I'm going to put up another graph right now. And this one shows the 56 biggest cities, with some showing decreases in violence, and a chunk at the top where violence is very large. And I know, viewers, that this is small on your screen, the print is, so that's Cleveland at the top, Nashville, Denver, and Baltimore right behind. So what do those countries, those cities, I should say, at the top represent? Are they places where crime is going up the fastest?
Yes. In 2015, there were a number of cities with very, very large increases in homicide. Those cities, some of your viewers may be able to see on that chart, but the cities that made the biggest contribution to the homicide rise in 15 included places like Chicago, Milwaukee, Cleveland, my own city of St. Louis. The following year, however, in 2016, we also saw a crime increase, a homicide increase, not quite as large as the year before, but still quite notable. But the mix of cities that led the way in 16 were not the same as the cities that led the way in 15. So in 2016, we see cities like Las Vegas and Phoenix and San Antonio and Louisville leading the way.
And
but I have to say Chicago
and
is also part of that group in 16.
Chicago at the top of the list, which it wasn't even in the top 4 there in 2015. So why is all this happening? What's changing? What ties this together?
Well, that's when things get tough. I think there are a couple of factors at work. The degree to which each contributes remains to be seen. The nation's been in the midst of an opioid epidemic now for several years. And I do think that is now, or has begun to register in increased levels of violence. People obtain heroin, they obtain synthetic opioids from the streets, and the demand for these drugs has gone way, way up. That brings more sellers into the market. Sellers get into disputes. Those disputes get settled with violence.
People tend to think of the opioid epidemic as a suburban or rural thing. It's affecting crime in cities too?
Well, in many ways it is. It is not simplifying things too much to say that it is a white phenomenon, that the current heroin epidemic and synthetic opioid epidemic, while it has spread into other populations, still remains most widespread in the white population. What's less known is whether the same drug dealing networks that used to deal lots and lots of cocaine and crack cocaine have just taken over the heroin markets, or whether there are new markets in the small towns and rural areas. I should say that the homicide increase we've seen is not simply an increase among African Americans, either as victims or perpetrators. White homicide rates and Latino homicide rates have also gone up. And the white homicide increase may be connected pretty strongly to the heroin epidemic.
That's really interesting and quite underreported. What about the so-called Ferguson effect that FBI Director Comey raised, which is that police are reluctant to do their jobs because of the backlash against killings of unarmed black men like in Ferguson?
Correct. Well, what that argument suggests is that the police have become disengaged from many of the communities that they protect and serve. And so they make fewer stops, they make fewer arrests, and crime goes up as a result. And in fact, when I looked at those figures for 2015 for the big cities, it is true that in 2015, overall violent crime arrest rates were down, less serious crime arrest rates were down, the fraction of crimes cleared with an arrest were down. The problem, however, is that those figures were down in years prior to the Ferguson incident in 2014 or other controversial use of force incidents. It looks to me, if disengagement's been going on, it's been happening for several years. It's not specific to the recent year or two.
And we have to leave it there, but it's also been a policy in a lot of places because of concern over mass incarceration and unnecessary incarceration to arrest people less for lesser crimes. So that's not necessarily the police fearing doing their jobs. At least that's one confounding factor. Professor, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And that's POTUS 2017 for today. We're here each week at this hour pouring cold, hard facts on the overheated political rhetoric. Next time, Trump versus big business. With his immigration restrictions, rejection of free trade, and pressure against outsourcing jobs, will corporate America turn against the president? Is already happening. See you next time for that. I'm Brian Lehrer. Thanks for watching.